All right. Good morning, everybody. Or I guess afternoon. It's about 2:30 now. Today we have a very exciting panel. This is something that I've been looking forward to all week. Today we're talking about modularity, specifically modular design or modular architecture. Kind of the philosophy of designing blockchain applications and blockchains in general through a modular means. So we have an incredible group of panels today. We're going to essentially break down modularity and understand, number one, how they each integrate modularity into their own projects, understand modularity as a concept, and kind of break down why it's important and potentially some of the downsides. So the kind of idea here, the vision here, is that by the end of the panel today, if you're listening, we'll have a better, more complete idea of modularity as a design philosophy, as a method of architecture. Because I personally truly believe that this is the future of blockchain design. And I think today, hopefully, we'll kind of get to the bottom of that and understand that in great capacity. So, I guess number one, to all of our panelists here today, could we start, before we dive too deep into this concept, we start with a quick introduction. So maybe give us 30 seconds, your name, the organization to represent, tell us a little bit about the project, and maybe what's next.
Hi. We are actually developing CPA virtual machine that actually supports WebAssembly by code. And we are targeting as execution layer for the modular blockchain setup. Thanks.
Jerry from Gas Zero, the CTO. We are a layer 2 CTO application layer that really provides gas users.
Hi, my name is Irene. I am head of strategy at Layer Zero Labs. We're the creator of the leading omni-chain interoperability protocol and also Stargate, the most widely used named asset bridge. Thank you.
Hey everyone, I'm Tiao. I'm the person behind there. I'm a research engineer at Lotus. At Lotus, we work with storage proofs to enable cross-chain data access as well as historical data access so that we can on-chain access any data all the way up to the Genesis block in a trustless way.
Gabby with one handsome person. Hi everyone, I'm Kenny. I'm one of the co-founders of Manta Network. For those of you that have been around all day, you probably listened to Victor earlier in the morning, the other co-founder, and we are building an L2 solution for ZK-enabled applications through our ZK as a service solution, Universal Circuits, and we are using multi-prover as a hybrid of OP Stack as well as ZK EVM.
I'm super excited about it today after hearing all that. When I was doing prep for this and I was looking for all the speakers, the different projects here is typically the way in which you guys modulate or integrate modularity. And the difference is super interesting. So I guess quickly, before we dive too deep into it, I'd like to, number one, set some preface both for our panel here today as well as our audience in terms of how this will be formatted. So for the first question, I'd like to get an answer from everybody. Then for questions 2 through 5, I'll basically throw it out there. Anybody that wants to answer is free to. Some of these can be a little bit specialized. So, number one, what I'd like to ask everybody in the panel today, we can go in the same sequential order, is modularity within your project. So we have this concept of modular design, right? This is, especially within the blockchain ecosystem, relatively new. Of course, we start with very monolithic design with things like Ethereum and Bitcoin, and now even within blockchain architecture as well as just general application design, we're moving very quickly to a focus on modularity. So the first one I'd like to ask to each of you is, how does your project implement modularity? Is it an important component of it? What does that look like for you? Maybe you want to start with.
Yeah, I think it's really complicated because we are actually doing execution layer for trust implementation and using a CK virtual machine festival, standard WebAssembly by code. And your question is that what kind of application can somehow leverage this component, right? And this is really hard to me because we do actually now as a hammer looking for nails because I think in Web3, and especially this time, there will be more layer 2 than application right? And the same scenario actually faced last week. We have this CK virtual machine, and we think that we can somehow turn the transaction-based blockchain into a job-based blockchain, like if you have a voting system and do not want to pay fees for every voting, then you probably can accumulate everything to the end until you reach a certain threshold of voting. So we're trying to convert the transaction-based interactive style into a job-based interactive style by derivation of the computations to a virtual machine. And I think that might be all of this, the modularity in the system. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Modularity, so we are application specific to infrastructure solutions that require us to think of modularity as. I can briefly talk about a little bit about how we divide our system into different modules or components. And then we have subcomponents and modules around these components. We have, first of all, this gas zero internal ecosystem. The reason that we have it is that it become a sort of like a first major component that kind of serve as a seamless layer for the user to onboard. We have a shield or so-called gateway that really provide, say, security access controls for controlling the users when they're trying to onboard our infrastructure. And then we have other submodules such as DID or availability articles, on our roadmap in our next 2 to 3 quarters. These are modeled as, modules for us to be developed. The second major component I'll say is the what we so-called policy or algorithmic trading protocols. This is the part where the app builders or the app developers, they can embed their business logic into our main sort of infrastructure. And then we have also this Treasure Gas Zero account that really can rebalance or maximize the MEVs for users. The last one, which is the most instrumental one, is our ZK system. The way we model this as a module so that we can iterate it fast is that right now we don't have the capability of developing our own ZK, next-gen ZK provers and things like that. So we have to leverage other, our partners to develop on the ZK part. And in the future, we might develop on our own. As you can see, our whole system is, designed in a very modular way.
It's super important. I mean, especially with something like Gas Zero. I love the concept here of running the gas fees and doing that, through these solutions is great. But designing these things with modularity as a key component, as well as kind of what you mentioned with the ongoing selection, I think these are really important. And then but I also want to understand, I mean specifically, of course, layer 0 is all about interoperability, composability, stuff like this. And I know that modularity is absolutely a core kind of value to you guys. So could you maybe tell us a little bit about how layer 0 utilizes modularity and how that fits in?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I love about this panel is it's so very cartographic in that a developer could be leveraging every single speaker's representative products in building their application, and layer 0 is very essential in that. So as an omni-chain interoperability protocol, developers can think of layer 0 as the piping which enables them to connect smart contracts on different L1s, L2s, rollups, app chains. And I think for the protocol itself, there's 3 angles of modularity that we consider when we're creating layer 0. So the first one is at the protocol level, and I would say the other one is at the deployment level by a developer, and then the third one is at the building level. So what I mean by that is at the protocol level, we design layer 0 so that the protocol can evolve with research. Let's say today there is a best practice for validation mechanisms. That is how the current version of our endpoints are built. However, if 5 years from now there is a different security technique, a new best-in-class one, which is very likely to occur, we as the builders of Layer Zero come from a research background and believe that the best validation techniques of today should not and will not be the best ones of 5 years from now, 10 years from now. We should be able to deploy new endpoints and allow developers to opt in to whichever version of Layer Zero they would like to, rather than monolithic security upgrades which push contagion risk across every project built on top of it. That's what modularity means at the vertical level. You can opt in to the versions of Layer Zero that Layer Zero Labs has deployed. Now, at the deployment level, this means that developers integrating Layer Zero can select things like the block confirmations, which they want for messages sent from chain A to chain B. They can select their off-chain entities, so they can price their security along a whole line of different off-chain open and permissionless options. There is a marketplace of oracles and relayers, and one of those components can be run by your own team. And this was informed by this belief that security should be incredibly modular. That's actually as part of the stack that must be modular. Whereas I think later on when we discussed an article written by Pat Asmani, there may be areas in the stack where modularity is overrated, for example. And then on the building layer, what I mean by modularity is you now can leverage the best of multiple chains and abstract away that complexity for your end users. So we have a few layer 2 representatives here. With Layer 0, you can now have settlement occur on one Layer 2. You can have users engaging from whichever wallet they'd like from a different one, liquidity from Ethereum. You could then run your gameplay if it's a game on your own app chain as well. And this is all under the hood. End user experience, just one click, one gas token from one wallet.
Yeah, well, I was actually doing some research and kind of personal exploration of Layer Zero, and I did read about kind of the endpoint usability and the contract libraries and being able to change out the grid as things change. And of course, modularity as a core concept is all about being able to change things and kind of move forward as the industry changes or as security changes. So this is super important.
Absolutely.
Tiago, maybe could you tell us about, from the perspective here of Notice, how you guys do modularity and what's the sort of difference?
Yeah, sure. So at Notice, modularity comes mostly when you're interacting with the protocol. So up until this point, we were somewhat monolithic technology, I would say. And recently we announced something called Turbo, which basically allows us to interact with the protocol just directing lines on chain, lines of code directly on chain. So before this, you'd have to do one Web2 style request off chain. And yeah, it's our, I would say, first major improvement towards having a more modular architecture. And our long-term vision at Lotus is to introduce more of these layers, so that everything becomes more abstracted to the developer at the end of the day. Also, we work with quite complex technology outside. Storage proofs require a lot of technical understanding, and they're not so easy to work with. We have a large team of engineers and researchers trying to make it easy for developers to use it. So I think as we make our architecture more modular and make more layers on top of it, we make it more and more easy to developers to integrate with it, so that we can abstract away all this crazy complexity involved with storage tools. And also, similar with Layer 0, all of these layers that we start introducing on top are completely opt-in because they are so modular, they kind of act as front ends to each other. And so if you are a more level developer who wants to have more control over your experience when using your Lotus, you are completely free to skip any of these abstractions that we create, and you can go as low level as you want. So yeah, we hope that we actually keep on introducing more layers to make it more easy to work with storage proofs.
Super interesting. This idea is actually something interesting to tell me. This idea of improving developer experience and modularity, I think, is interesting in that we're actually going to touch briefly in the last question, the relationship between modularity and developer experience. It's really cool to hear that because they're using this in a way that actually improves developer experience and abstracts complexity. So this is very cool. Kenny, could you tell us about, from the Manta Network perspective, how you guys want modularity? I know this is also a core value of you guys, so maybe tell us about how that plays into your guys'
Yeah, sure. So there are two things that we specifically do in relation to modularity, and those two things are primarily consistent around the theme of frictionless user experience when it comes to ZK-enabled applications. And I can give you a whole thesis on why I believe ZK-enabled applications are the next generation of dApps, but that's another question. But let's just assume they're the next generation of dApps, right? And so if you were to assume that, you would look into the existing sort of EVM ecosystem where all the developer activity, all the user activity congregates, and you would realize that there's not really too many ZK-enabled applications. And when I say ZK-enabled, it's like any sort of features that use ZK, besides, the roll-up side. The reason is because they are very hard to build, and they are very expensive to use, right? I don't know how many of you guys have tried using some type of ZK-enabled application on Ethereum. The gas fees themselves are very, very costly. And so that makes it very unscalable because no one wants to use it, no one wants to spend $100 to do a private transaction. And so with Manta, one of the things we set out to do was try to figure out how to solve that. So we solve it using modularity in two ways. The first way is through the infrastructure layer, and that kind of segregates the execution, the settlement, the consensus, and everything else, the data availability especially. And we partner with Celestia to do that. And so what separating the data availability does here is that it actually lowers the gas fee significantly for the user because the data availability is actually one of the most expensive components of gas fee right now. I mean, there is like EIPs in place to kind of resolve that to some extent. But high level is that in order to really significantly reduce gas fees, right, like looking at modularizing the DA and segregating it from the rest of the entire stack on the infrastructure layer helps significantly. And then the second part is around the ZK development in general. And so what we're doing is we're providing ZK as a service rather than building the service from scratch, compiling from scratch. Because most developers, especially Solidity developers, they are great smart contract developers, but they are not amazing cryptographers. It's a different class of engineering. And so instead of having to build the same thing over and over again, because everyone's building the same circuits for the similar use cases, we actually abstract those circuits and provide them in a modular manner in order for people to actually deploy just with 2 to 3 lines of code through an SDK, rather than having to write hundreds if not thousands of lines of code themselves. So yeah, those are the 2 ways that we're using modularity to really alleviate the user experience to enable that next generation of ZK-enabled apps.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think this is actually the perfect segue into question 2. So, unlike question 1, I'll do your result for the first question. Whoever wants to answer it is free to. So, this next question is actually very related to this idea of modularity through the separation of these different components of blockchain architecture. So, execution, settlement, availability, kind of that. So, over the past 1 to 2 years, when we talk about modularity, when we talk about the modular stack, right, this term, the focus has been on layered modularity. So, specifically, what I just talked about, right, the separation of block architecture into consensus, execution, settlement, and availability. So, as earlier this year, I believe, OP's Bedrock had an upgrade that essentially introduced the concept of modularity to proving systems. So not just the core architecture of blockchain. So with this context, right, I want to ask you guys how you believe the path of modularity as a design philosophy, as a concept, as a definition, will evolve over the next 1 to 2 years. With this kind of shift in understanding modularity that's happened stemming from the upgrade of Zedmark latest year, how will that evolve? How will that change? Whoever wants to start, feel free.
I think you can start by saying, well, one, we work very closely with OP Labs on many of the product launches, and I'm so excited that you guys chose to build on the OP stacks, because I think their vision of the super chain is one that aligns so closely with how we see the world evolving at layer 0. However, one thing that is top of mind for us when we're talking about security in this space is how you can design your protocol and select infrastructure that evolves with time, like I said before, evolves with research, with better capabilities you can provide developers, but offer those upgrades and push those upgrades in a way that protect projects that leverage your infrastructure from smart contract upgrades that may have buggy code in them. And that really is the existential threat of our whole industry. We've had so many exploits that were caused by seemingly benign upgrades to code bases. And I think this is something that informed how we built layer 0, again, in a way that can adopt changes, but allow developers to still vet and opt into them once they, one, have stood the test of time, so secured value over time, is the matrix that I see in my mind, but then also have been diligenced by developers themselves. And I think the OP Labs team did a really excellent job of this with Bedrock. Really all-star from a communication standpoint. Layer 0 contracts and Stargate contracts are often 1 and 2 most gas consuming on OP mainnet, and the way that they delivered that upgrade was really seamless.
Perfect, thank you.
And just a little bit, probably from another perspective, first of all, definitely see modularity as a new trend and a new philosophy, provide more versatile adaptivity, interoperability, easier to adopt for developers, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it can go beyond. You mentioned about security. I think it can also extend it to, say, privacy and data governance, right? And all those layers can be, build the components and modules in a modular way. I want to say a little bit from our perspective, right? So, on another note, as a more of an application-specific layer, sometimes it's really hard to purely abstract the modules in a modular way. So we have to, step back a little bit and try to look at the global picture and try to say, is this modular design really serve the purpose for Argo? And Argo, is providing users with clear gas. And of course, there are a lot of trade-off to make. By the way, agree with you, DK is the next era. So, if we're talking about DK, for example, there are a lot of trade-offs you need to make, right? So, for example, you might want to, increase your, say, the speed time to generate the proof, but at the same time, you can't make the proof shorter. So you have to make the trade-off depending on your use cases, right? So I do believe that it's a trend, but it kind of depends on users.
And also, I think philosophically, modular is not really a new idea. Actually, it exists everywhere. And for some reason, when it comes to blockchain, we're just like, new shiny term. But in reality, right, like if you build systems outside of Web3, if you build any sort of traditional, quote unquote, centralized application, right, like if you build something as simple as a website with a login, I mean, I don't know how many of you guys are developers, but who here builds their database from scratch, right? Like no one does that. Everyone uses MySQL or they use, I don't even know, it's been so long since I've touched databases, but everyone uses open source or enterprise level databases, right? Like no one builds it from scratch. And so for those of you that aren't coders, it's the same as like you're about to start a business. I'm assuming many of you guys have projects or are entrepreneurs, but how many of you guys do your own accounting, like with pen and paper? No one does that, right? We all use accounting software because there's things out there that can help us do things better than we can do ourselves, and that allows us to focus on our core competency, which is delivering that value proposition. Whether it's a DEX, whether it's an NFT marketplace, or whatever it may be, at the end of the day, you don't have to, and you shouldn't have to care about certain components everywhere from layer 0, not in terms of like the project, but layer 0 in terms of the networking stack, all the way up to like whatever layer N that you need to focus on. You just focus specifically on your application and developing that core value proposition. And so I think from that perspective, modularity, like from in a philosophical sense, is I think critical to really scaling out infrastructure systems and applications in the future, because there's no way that you're going to be a jack of all trades and a master of all.
Absolutely. And, I think you're totally right in that modularity, like you mentioned, as a philosophy, as a design philosophy, as an architecture, is not something that's existed. It's been in Web2 for every application you build in Web2. Ultimately implements modularity in some way, shape, or form. For blockchains, of course, we started with things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Very monolithic designs. Even applications, in some cases, follow these monolithic designs. And just now, we're moving into this direction, like you mentioned, where we're achieving and solving scalability problems with implementations of this concept that, of course, is existing in Web2 for so long. In my opinion, there's a lot of answers to this question of how do we scale Web3? And it's the internal question. We didn't really have the answer, I don't know. But I think modularity gets really close, and specifically modularity in the sense of like we talked about briefly, the separation of different components of Web3. So this is really important. Of course, again, what you guys are doing at Management Network, it's an incredible evolutions. The next question I want to talk about, as we kind of go down the list here, is something interesting that maybe a few guys have an opinion on. So, following this idea of modularity via the separation of blockchain architecture components, we've seen some projects, some blockchains, take this concept of modularity and take the execution layer and throw them into non-EVM environments. So SVM, MoveVM, stuff like that. Do you guys have an opinion on progress of this approach? Or do you think it's a good approach? Do you think it's scalable? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So I think I can take this question. I think before the narrative was pretty much around the EVM is the best VM for blockchains, and we're going to build everything around EVMs. And this clearly does not work for every use case, right? The EVM has many problems, it's quite limited, and it's completely realistic to try to make one size fit all, right? It just doesn't work. And so as we've seen more recent primitives, we've been seeing like a lot of diversity in the execution layer. We have 10 of new VMs popping up as the ones you just said. And personally, I think it's quite a good idea. I think especially in the ZK rollup space, where Herdose plays a big part, we're seeing a lot of these. It makes a lot of sense. The ZK VMs are very. DVM is not ZK friendly by nature, right? And so I think especially in the ZK space, it makes a lot of sense to try to invite with our VMs. We're seeing a lot of rollups doing this. One that we work very closely with is StarkNet. So StarkNet doesn't use DVM, it uses the Cairo VM or the OOM, which was tailored from the beginning to be ZK friendly, right? And so I believe I've done this example, a lot of new rollups and a lot of new technologies can go outside of EVM and make something more tailored to the problem, more efficient, more scalable. And I think this is the right way to achieve scalability and building modular systems.
Perfect, thank you. Anybody else have any opinion on the integration of non-EVM runtimes within the execution layer? Perfect. All right, and I guess actually on a very similar note, kind of actually what you mentioned, Kenny, in terms of what we've seen within modularity a lot is the separation of execution from data availability. Of course, data availability, this is a big part of like Celestia hands, for example, because this data availability, like I mentioned, is a very expensive component of block architecture. So the question here is that as we separate execution and data availability, we've seen this single issue pop up quite a bit, which is liquidity fragmentation. Do any of you have an opinion on liquidity fragmentation, and particularly this issue on, it pops up as a result of the separation, the segmentation? Does anyone have an opinion on that, potentially have a solution?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak on this. Liquidity fragmentation is an issue that every founder of protocol thinks about, particularly when they are launching on multiple chains. And I think this time last year, the question was, is the future multi-chain? If it is, what are those implications? And today, it's so obvious that it's the present that we're in right now. And with that, Modular Stack, for example, and Polygon Supernets and large subnets, so many other ways to launch rollups and app chains. There may be hundreds of these side chains by the end of the year, and the question is how we solve that fragmentation of liquidity. Our answer at layer 0 is through omni-chain standards. So what I mean by this is, about a year and a half ago, we launched a standard called the OFT, or the Omni-Chain Fungible Token, and the parallel standard for NFTs called ONFTs. And this is a way to launch or integrate existing tokens so that they are native on multiple chains and just seamlessly transfer between them. So rather than needing external liquidity, market makers, for example, you don't need anything beyond this unified liquidity that occurs with contracts that have the same addresses and same token IDs across multiple chains, and it leverages layer 0 messaging to manage the state across all of them. And so this is one way to solve this problem of fragmented liquidity, and the Starknet protocol is also a way to do this with native pools of stablecoins on different chains, and in one click with one gas token, users can move their assets across different chains. So it's an incredibly important challenge to solve. The omni-chain standards have proven to do so and have been incredibly creative for games, for example, that are creating their own ecosystems, DeFi protocols that are launching their governance and protocol tokens so that they can move seamlessly between chains as they launch their protocol on those chains, and for stablecoins and CBDC as well.
100%. The omni-chain standard, is that the correct term?
Yes.
That this approach that Layer Zero takes, I think, is an incredible solution to this problem that, I mean, even outside of just this idea and concept of modularity, liquidity fragmentation has always existed within the Web3 use. It's always been a major problem. And I know that recently, especially Layer Zero has seen quite a bit of success in solving this problem for a lot of different projects, especially, I believe, of course, the NFT side is a little bit different in terms of liquidity management. I know you guys had, was it Pudgy Penguins that just launched on Layer Zero?
Yes, I think 6 months ago, they opened their portal and integrated NFTs so that Pudgy's that are on Ethereum can now transfer to Polygon, BNB, and Arbitrum.
That's awesome. You know, I think solutions like this, omni-chain solutions like this, you know, as we're kind of talking about this idea of modularity and using multiple different components to create, even in most cases, application-specific blockchains. This issue is ever present. I think solutions like Layer Zero are an incredible way to solve this. Does anyone else have any ideas or opinions on liquidity fragmentation like this?
Sure. So yeah, for those, one of the main use cases that we see developers building on top of us is solving liquidity fragmentation. The most obvious way is that we were doing this up until now, but by building bridges like Layer Zero, an incredible job of mitigating this problem. But sometimes bridging is not enough, as users don't want to keep on bridging assets across different chains. Every so often, it's quite it can be quite a painful process to do. And so for us, something that we've been seeing quite often is where you can take your assets to one chain without actually bringing your assets there. And how does this work? Well, this is thanks to the power of storage proofs. So with storage proofs, you can prove on an asset on a certain chain on another chain, and you don't have to actually bridge the assets. This works for any kind of token, including NFTs, ERC20s. We see a lot of use cases regarding this. Of course, you can also build a bridge on top of this and actually bridge the assets if you want. But the whole idea is that we don't actually have to bridge your assets and we can keep them on whichever chain you prefer.
If I can ask a quick question, would that involve sending a message from the chain to convey the proof to the other chain?
So we have multiple ways of getting the message across. One of the ways that we use is we rely on the native messaging system of Rollup. So we want to make it clear it's the native messaging system. We don't rely on third parties. We do, for example, we rely on Layer Zero, but we choose to rely only on a native messaging bridge. We did. We're also very limited, so that we can all integrate with Ethereum tools because it's it's only when we can do there's no native messaging systems between L1, and for this we would need something like Layer Zero to.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent use case, and it shows how arbitrary contract invocation is necessary for user experiences that are even better than moving assets between chains.
I love it. You were good?
Sorry, really quick thought is just that, like, the nature of this question, right? Like, it's like, for me, if I had an answer to liquidity fragmentation, I wouldn't be working on Manta, I promise. That's a huge problem. But I think, like, one thing to think about here is that, just because there is liquidity fragmentation, with or without data availability in this case, this is sort of a horizontal scalability concept, I don't think that means that, it's a discouragement to use these types of solutions that sound up technology, because at the end of the day, like, by nature, liquidity flows to value. And so if we're able to build that value through these innovations with Celestia or with other TA solutions, then I think that, there's going to be a battle and there's going to be an explosion of the L2s, especially for roll-up as a service, making it so easy. And then there's going to be a consolidation at the same time. And after that consolidation, I think liquidity will find its home, and at the same time we'll have exponential value compared to where we are today.
Absolutely. And I love the conversation about this topic. It's super interesting. And I think, overall, when we think about scalability and the problems that come with different scalability solutions, in specific modularization, and, using different blockchains. Liquidity verification being one of these main issues. I think that we're very close, that's the zone panel story, but really, within the Web3 ecosystem, we're so close to solving major fundamental issues within blockchain design architecture. And I think some of the things that we talked about and some of the problems with the panel there are absolutely contributing that in a way. So, we're kind of hitting time here. The kind of the main thoughts that I want to leave with everybody is that, as we talk about today, as all of our planning talked about, modularity and scalability, finding solutions to problems that come up with modularity, come with, of course, inevitably trying to solve the scalability problem and service for users. These solutions are close. I think that the panelists here today are truly solving all these problems, and I'm very excited about it. So even at Particle Network, which is the organization I represent, we're also very intently on modularity into our design. Because truly, especially in the context of blockchain applications, this is a game changer in terms of solving multiple problems. So that's going to be it for our event today. Diving into the Modular Stack. Hopefully, everybody here in the audience kind of got something out of this today and understood potentially more about modularity and how it's being implemented, and how we're solving some of the problems that actually extend from it. Thank you to all of our panelists today. Some incredible answers here. Love hearing all about this. This is such an important and key topic. But I think that's about everybody. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.